Good morning and welcome to the 18th meeting of the Health and Sport Committee in 2020. We have received apologies today from Alex Cole-Hamilton. The first item on the agenda is subordinate legislation, consideration of affirmative instruments regarding emergency public health measures to prevent the spread of infection or contamination with coronavirus. The regulations impose requirements on people arriving in Scotland and operational commercial services for international passengers travelling to Scotland by sea or by air from outside the open borders. We will have an evidence session with the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and his officials on all three instruments, and we will move directly to questions. Once we have concluded our questions, we will have the formal debate on each motion for the corresponding instrument. The instruments we are looking at today are the Health Protection Coronavirus International Travel Scotland Regulations 2020, the Health Protection Coronavirus Public Health Information for Passengers Travelling to Scotland Regulations 2020, and the Health Protection Coronavirus International Travel Scotland Amendment Regulation 2020. And I welcome to the committee Hunza Yousaf, Cabinet Secretary for Justice, who is accompanied by John Nicholson from the Community Surveillance Division for Health, Anita Poppleston from the Police Division for Enforcement, and Gary Cox, Head of Aviation with Transport. Welcome, Cabinet Secretary and officials. As with previous virtual meetings such as this, we are going to take questions in an agreed order. I will begin in a moment, and then I will ask a number of questions, and then I will come back with one or two more. So thank you very much, and can I remind everyone to keep questions and answers succinct, and please give broadcasting staff a few moments to operate your microphones before beginning to ask your questions or to provide them. So thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. As I say, welcome. Can I ask you to start with, if you can tell us how many people are currently quarantined in Scotland under the regulations, and how many have arrived for whom exemptions apply? Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much. Convener, good morning to all of the committee, and thanks for the opportunity to come and to speak to you about these regulations. So, direct answer to your question, the figures as I have them this morning, we have roughly approximately 3,200 people that have arrived since the beginning of these regulations. And you'll remember, Convener, you'll be aware certainly that the figures for exemptions, of course, Border Force will do what we might term colloquially as spot checks, as opposed to checking every single person that comes through and whether or not they're exempt. So based on that kind of spot checking analysis done by Border Force, approximately 18%, 18% have applied for some kind of exemption.
Thank you very much. And can you tell us how much monitoring and enforcement has taken place in respect of those who have already been subject to these regulations? Quarantine. Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I think this has been a kind of regular theme of questioning around some of these regulations. So you'll bear in mind that there's two potential offences that somebody could commit. One offence is in relation to information and refusing or not providing the the information as per the regulations, and that is enforced by Border Force, and in some respects monitored by Border Force as well. So they do spot checks to see whether or not people have filled out that passenger locator form. So that is done by Border Force. So far, from the work that Border Force have done in Scotland, there's been no need to issue any fixed penalty notice. So that would suggest high levels of compliance. In fact, Border Force tell us that levels of compliance for those coming off flights in Scotland has been very, very high indeed. So that's good to hear. The other offence relates to breach of the self-isolation requirements, and it would be Police Scotland who would enforce that. And I've said from the very beginning, much in line with police forces right across the United Kingdom, that Police Scotland would be taking a reactive approach. So if they have intelligence to suggest somebody is not self-isolating, or indeed they've been told by a third party that may be the case, then they will do that. And again, the message coming from Police Scotland is that the self-isolation compliance has been very high, and again, they haven't issued any fixed penalty notices in regard to breach of self-isolation. I suppose the final point to make on monitoring is that in addition to what I've already discussed, there is also spot checks, or dip sampling maybe is a better term, by public health officials. They will contact around 20% of travellers, and that will be to give public health guidance in relation to quarantine and self-isolation.
So it sounds from what you've said thus far that the evidence so far is that the arrangements in place are effective. Clearly some other countries and territories such as Hong Kong have used tagging for those who are required to be in quarantine in order to ensure compliance. Is that something that you have considered or would consider in the circumstances? Cabinet Secretary.
If I heard you correctly, forgive me that I might have misheard you, but I think you asked me about tagging.
Yes,
if that was the case, then it's not something I've considered or we've considered here in Scotland. I think, one, the compliance is high, and therefore I'm not sure there's a need to go there. I suppose, secondly, the connotations we have in Scotland and around electronic monitoring, I'm not sure people would take well to being tagged and electronically monitored in that regard. So, but I don't think it's necessary nor proportionate at this time. But obviously, we always keep these measures under review. But tagging is certainly something we're not looking at currently.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I'll now call on Emma Harper. Emma.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. According to our briefing papers, the regulations were brought into force without any consultation with the carriers, and that the carriers are required to ensure travellers are made aware of quarantine on 3 occasions in their journey. So when they book, when they check in, and when in transit. So I'm interested to know what the impact the regulations have made on the carriers, Cabinet Secretary, and also just to be clear that the carriers are not just our planes, that they're also our seafaring vessels, our ferries, such as the ones coming from Larne and Belfast over to the port of Cairnryan.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks, Tim Harper, for that question, and she's of course right in to make the point that she makes in relation to the very latter point, and I know she has obviously an interest in particular in those routes. She'll be aware of the exemptions that apply for the common travel area, of course, which are important, and they were largely to, so that there is a clear mechanism in place for those that wish to travel from the Republic of Ireland into Northern Ireland, and then perhaps not stay in Northern Ireland or indeed come over to the mainland UK. But the regulations also make sure that there's a safeguard there for those who use Dublin as potentially a hub airport, so it still requires them to have to self-isolate, minus the amount of time they've spent in the Republic of Ireland, just to be clear about a common travel area. In relation to the more substantial point that Emma Harper makes, I suppose it depends on your definition of consultation. So in any normal policy like this, we'd love to do a 3-month consultation as per usual government guidelines. But clearly when it comes to emergency legislation or emergency regulations, that's not possible. So has there been a formal consultation in the way that we would do normally? Of course, that's not been possible, but clearly there have been discussions and engagements with not just the carriers, but also the airports, and indeed, as Emma Harper rightly says, other transport providers as well. I'm only to continue that. Again, committee will be very aware there's a review every 3 weeks, and we're already, of course, considering the data to inform us of the next review, and clearly the feedback from carriers, transport providers, airports, hubs is going to be hugely important to that.
Thank you. Emma Harper.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Final question is, what role will the carriers have in the 3 weekly review of the regulations, and will they be consulted on proposals and asked to provide data on the use?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, thanks, Emma Harper. So I maybe just touched upon that very briefly, that yes, of course, discussions and engagement will be really important with the carriers and other transport providers, and I must make mention that there are, as Emma Harper said, it's more than just the carriers, and it's more than just aviation as well. So there'll be a conversation right across the board with those that have been impacted in relation to collecting some of that data. Clearly, we'll always be driven by the public health imperative when it comes to the review. So we don't doubt that there's been an impact on the transport sector as a whole, but particularly the aviation industry in this regard. Now, that's not simply down to the regulations before you. There's been obviously a worldwide impact on aviation due to coronavirus, but clearly they'll be part of that consideration when it comes to the 3-week review, but will always be driven by the public health imperative and the data that we have in front of us.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And in light of your answers thus far, are you satisfied that the appropriate mechanisms are in place to ensure, first of all, that all visitors to Scotland do complete and submit the appropriate documentation, and to ensure that carriers are indeed providing the passenger with the required notification at each of the 3 stages that Emma Harper described?
Short answer is yes, Convener. I'm quite satisfied with the data that we have in front of us. There's ample opportunity for a traveller to be reminded of the quarantine rules that exist, and they're directed to the UK Government's Home Office website in relation to that form. But hard copies can also be made available if necessary. But thus far, as I say, the short answer to your question is yes, I'm satisfied. Finally,
from me, should a fixed penalty notice be required on a temporary visitor to the United Kingdom, how would that be enforced in Scotland? The event of a fixed penalty notice. Cabinet Secretary.
About enforcement for temporary visitors coming into Scotland. So if that was the case, and remember, enforcement will only ever be, our fixed penalty notice will only ever be the last resort in terms of encouraging people to either comply or indeed provide the data. If it's needed, then there are measures in place to be able to ensure that fixed penalty notice is either paid when they're in country, or indeed if it has to be followed up when the person leaves the country, then there are processes in place to be able to do that. But that would really only be a last resort, and thus far obviously hasn't been needed.
Thank you very much. That's understood and appreciated. There are no further questions from other members of the committee. We will therefore now move on to agenda items 2, 3 and 4, which are the formal debates on the affirmative SSIs, on which we have just taken evidence from the Cabinet Secretary. We will start with the Health Protection Coronavirus International Travel Scotland Regulations 2020. I remind members that we're now in a debate process. If any member wishes to debate this motion, I will invite the Cabinet Secretary to move it in a moment. But if any member wishes to participate in such a debate, please let me know now, and I will call on the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move motion S5M 22031 in the name of his colleague Jean Freeman. Cabinet Secretary.
Content to move, Convener.
Thank you very much. I have no indications of colleagues who wish to debate the motion. The question is that the motion S5M 22031 be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much. That is agreed without division. Can we then move on to the next item on the agenda, agenda item 3? The second formal debate is on affirmative instrument, the Health Protection Coronavirus Public Health Information for Passengers Travelling to Scotland Regulations 2020. The same procedure as a moment ago for the previous one. I will invite the Cabinet Secretary to move the motion. If any member wishes to debate the motion, please let me know now. Thank you very much. And the question, can I then invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S5M 22017 in the name of Jean Freeman. Cabinet Secretary.
Moved, Convener.
Thank you very much. There is no member who has indicated a wish to debate this motion. The question is therefore that the motion S5M 22017 be approved. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. Thank you very much. We therefore move, and that motion is therefore agreed. We then move on to the third and final affirmative instrument. This is the Health Protection Coronavirus International Travel Scotland Amendment Regulations 2020. Again, the same rules and procedures apply. I will invite the Cabinet Secretary to move the motion in a moment. If any member wishes to debate the motion, let me know now. Cabinet Secretary, can I invite you to move motion S5N 22018 in the name of Jean Freeman. Cabinet Secretary.
Moved, Convener.
Thank you very much. No member has indicated that they wish to debate this motion. I therefore put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S5N 22018 be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much. That concludes consideration of the affirmative instrument. I thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for their attendance, and we now will suspend briefly before moving on to agenda item 5. Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Thank you very much. As all our witnesses are now in place, we will now resume the meeting. The 5th item on our agenda is our final public evidence session on the Forensic Medical Services Victims of Sexual Offences Scotland Bill at stage 1. A number of issues have already been discussed with witnesses in oral evidence sessions, as well as significant written evidence having been received, and this week's meeting is an opportunity to discuss the position of the Scottish Government in relation to these issues. I welcome to the committee Jean Freeman, Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, who is accompanied by Dr. Gregor Smith, Interim Chief Medical Officer, Greg Walker, Bill Team Leader, and Tansy Main, Unit Head in the CMO's Rape and Sexual. Thank you all for joining us today. As in previous sessions, we will ask questions in a pre-agreed order. I would remind members when asking questions and witnesses in answering to keep questions and answers succinct. Please to give broadcasting staff a few seconds to operate your microphone before beginning to ask a question or to provide an answer. And members, please to say to indicate when you're on your final question. Can I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement on this evidence session of up to 5 minutes. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to you and to colleagues. And can I start by offering my apologies for the technical problems we had at our end that has held you up. But let me be brief then in my opening remarks, and thank you for continuing your scrutiny of the bill at what is a uniquely challenging time. The progression of the bill, I think, sends an important message that we are committed to improving the experience of victims of sexual crime throughout their health and justice experience. I would also like to put on record my appreciation for all of the staff who have worked in this area, notwithstanding the fact that they've also been addressing the challenge of the pandemic. And my grateful thanks to Dr. Gregor Smith as Interim Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, who, as you say, joins me this morning, for providing continued national leadership of the task force, which is overseeing the improvement of these services across the country. This is an important and focused bill that, as a government, we have chosen to prioritise. It will underpin the work of the task force, work of which has firmly positioned forensic medical services as a healthcare response first and foremost. All Health Board Chief Executives have committed to the delivery of sustainable trauma-informed services in line with National Healthcare Improvement Scotland standards. Transformation in the response to rape and sexual assault is already well underway through the work of the task force, supported by £8.5 million of government funding over 3 years. The bill and the task force's work together address recommendations in Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary's report in 2017. As I set out in my letter to the committee on the 5th of May, a comprehensive package of resources has been developed to ensure consistency in approach to the pathways of care, as well as the recording, collation and reporting of data in relation to these services. Implementation of the clinical pathway, national documentation and national data sets for adults was delayed due to COVID-19, but plans are now being developed to deliver virtual training for health boards to prepare them for implementation of a wider package of resources covering all age groups before the end of the calendar year. Other important improvements are also being progressed over the next 12 months, including developing the role of nurse sexual offence examiners. the implementation of a national clinical IT system, and of course preparing health boards for the commencement of the bill. I welcome that the committee has spoken to survivors of rape and sexual assault. The government shares your commitment to learning from people with lived experience. I was heartened that Sandy Brindley of Rape Crisis Scotland acknowledged in her oral evidence that improvements to victims' experiences as a result of the work of the task force are beginning to bed in, particularly in recent months. The bill will enshrine in law a holistic healthcare and recovery-focused model and provide consistent access to self-referral across Scotland. This means that if a person who has experienced rape or sexual assault does not want to tell the police straight away or is undecided, the health board can obtain certain forensic evidence and keep it safe. And if the person decides not to tell the police, the evidence will be destroyed after a period of time or on request. Having this choice available to people after a significant trauma is vital to giving people control over what happens to them at a time when control has been taken away. I want to emphasise, however, that the principles of trauma-informed and person-centred care will apply whether or not a police report is to be made. The bill supports the delivery model of a coordinated multi-agency service to ensure a smooth pathway of care for the person, and in that regard, I consider the bill to be Barnard-House ready. I'm aware, Convener, that there are a number of issues that have been raised with the committee and that there will be a number of questions that you have. So with your agreement, I will pause there and look forward to answering your questions with the colleagues who have joined me.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. That is appreciated. As you said yourself, we heard directly from survivors of rape and sexual assault, and we also heard from Sandy Brindley in person as well as in writing, and she put on record that the single most important issue for survivors was access to a female doctor or female examiner. How confident is the Scottish Government that victims of rape and sexual offence, through the bill, through other changes you've described, how confident are you that they will have a real choice of the gender of the examiner? Cabinet Secretary.
So I have a confidence in that based on the following. I should say I agree completely that people should have that choice. I think it is very important, particularly in those circumstances. We now have 61% of sexual offence examiners are now women, and 70% of the doctors who have completed the NHS Education for Scotland Essentials Foundation training in sexual offence examinations are women too. In addition, of course, the introduction of the nurse sexual offence examiner adds to the availability of that choice and the work to ensure that we maximise the choice across the country will continue. There are clearly some levels of restriction to an extent in that where you have a team of sexual offence examiners that is predominantly male, those individuals will be on contracts, and so you have to find other ways to add to the number so that you can offer that choice. But the task force has that work well in hand, and I think that 61% figure is a significant improvement and an indication of the commitment to ensure that that choice is available.
Thank you very much. We heard from Dr. Anne McClellan from NHS Lanarkshire about the work that was being done at regional level, recruitment networks, if you like, and she talked about the potential benefit of a national network for recruiting female examiners. Do you envisage that recruitment could potentially cause a difficulty? Are there issues in areas such as the recruitment of paediatricians where that's appropriate? And what is your view of the mechanism, if you like, for identifying and recruiting, for networking in relation to female examiners?
I think that there's 2 points to make in that response, Convener, and if you, with your agreement, I'd ask Dr. Smith also to come in on this. It would be foolish to deny that there are not recruitment challenges across just about any area of our health workforce at this point. and clearly there are some recruitment challenges in terms of paediatricians, but I think that the work that is underway to ensure that we have the training that I've described and the pathway that I've described is really about creating a career here, and something I think that Dr. Smith might want to say a bit more about.
Gregor Smith.
So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to kind of speak to you today about what for me is a really important bill and area that there's been a tremendous amount of work on. I mean, the whole issue of recruitment and retention in this area is incredibly important. One of the things that the task force has sought to do over the years that it has been in place is to make the role of a forensic medical examiner a much more attractive role, not only to attract more people into that, but also to make sure that we retain that expertise within that role as well. In the past, when I first started to become involved with people who were forensic medical examiners, it was, I have to say, a very male-dominated profession or specialty at that point in time. And over the last decade, what I've seen is a much greater number of women who've come forward expressing a desire to develop a career. And that aspect of developing a career in this is really important. We need to make sure that they're working within safe and effective pathways of care, that they're getting the support as part of a multidisciplinary team to provide that care, and they're working to quality care standards that they can really get a sense of to buy into as well. So all that put together certainly makes it a much more attractive role to do that, but we've also got to make the practicalities of the role much more easy to deal with as well. Many of the doctors who come into this line of work actually do it as part of a portfolio career. So as you've already mentioned, they may have other backgrounds, they may be paediatricians, they may be gynaecologists, they may be GPs. And what we need to be able to do is to make sure that the work that they're doing in relation to this fits very much with the wider portfolio of work. A common issue which was raised in the past was the whole problem of making sure that we facilitated court appearances. Often what we had in the past was a situation where people really enjoyed the work of a forensic medical examiner, but they found that some of the practicalities in being able to move and shift the rest of the portfolio of work around to accommodate court appearances was incredibly difficult. So working with the justice system to make sure that we're facilitating that in a much more proportionate and better way has been something which again makes us a more attractive career and is much more likely to retain the expertise within this service as well. The Cabinet Secretary touched upon the whole issue of using the nurse specialist trained nurses as sexual offence examiners as well. And again, I think this is a really important area to ensure that at the basis of everything that we're doing and the care that we're providing, we make sure that the choices and the preferences of those people who've experienced sexual assault are being catered for.
Thank you very much. And finally, for now, from me, Cabinet Secretary, is it the government's aspiration that there should be a 24/7 examination service across Scotland? And if that is the ambition, how optimistic are you about making progress in that regard? Cabinet Secretary.
So his standards set a 3-year time frame, so that anyone who's experienced rape or sexual assault should be able to access forensic medical examination within that 3-year time frame, and that is the objective that we're working to. There is progress in each health board to build the capacity and capability of the workforce to achieve that. But there are undoubtedly challenges, as I know that you will understand, Convener, in remote and island communities in being able to meet that standard as easily as we might be able to do elsewhere. So that said, though, that is still our intention, and the task force's work with the relevant boards and with their colleagues is to see what other steps we might take in order to overcome the particular challenges. So at this point, I am confident that we will be able to do that in the majority of Scotland, and I am confident in our commitment to try and ensure that we can ensure coverage of the whole of Scotland, notwithstanding there are challenges that we need to find ways through.
Thank you very much. I now call on David Stewart. David Stewart.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Good morning also to all our witnesses this morning. Why was it decided to restrict self-referral for forensic medical examinations to young people over the age of 16?
Cabinet Secretary.
So there is a degree of debate around this. I think it's only sensible to acknowledge that, with some arguing for it being age 13, others for 18. The consensus view that was reached was 16. However, I'm very conscious of that debate, and we've not closed our minds to further discussion on that age limit.
David Stewart.
Thank you for that answer, Cabinet Secretary. You may be aware of other evidence we've had before this committee. Dr. Anne McClellan from NHS Lanarkshire made the following powerful points in her evidence. 2 quick points. She said we should encourage self-referral in 13 to 15 years, as 40% of last year's 13,000 sexual assaults were victims under 18, and secondly, 1 in 4 under 16-year-olds are sexually active. Does the Cabinet Secretary share my view that the extremely low reporting and conviction rates of child sexual assaults could be reversed by encouraging self-referral to under 16-year-olds?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think it's fair to say, and again, I may ask our CMO to come in. What I think it's fair to say is that I'm very cognizant of the debate and the different views, many strongly held powerful points being made. And as I said, I am open to that discussion and to looking at whether or not there is a case to be made that we would support for a lower age. As I said, the consensus reached was around 16, as I've also noted. Other arguments favour 18, but 16 seemed to us to fit in particular with the age of majority in other areas across life in Scotland and so on. But we're very happy to have a further discussion. Dr. McGregor may want to add to that in terms of the process that was gone through in reaching the position that's currently in the draft bill.
Gregor Smith.
Okay, so thank you. I mean, I think this is a really important area for discussion, isn't it? And over the course of when these proposals were developed, there was a great deal of discussion, particularly with the stakeholders around about whether the balance of views should be that the age of for self-referral should be 13 to 16, or as Cabinet Secretary has already outlined, perhaps even 18. Where there was the strongest consensus from particularly the clinical community that balanced the needs for and aims that self-referral was trying to achieve, but also with those needs to make sure that we were safeguarding younger people as well. Very much the strong consensus view was that 16 was the right cut-off point for that just now. Now, we've always adopted a position where we would be open to further discussion in relation to that, but at the moment, certainly we should be cognizant of the view that the kind of the consensus, the clinical consensus in relation to this, balancing all the needs that relate to young people, sat with the age of 16.
David Stewart.
Could I thank both our witnesses for these helpful suggestions? Could I perhaps give one possible or two possible ways forward? One is that you use a sunset clause within the legislation, even if you keep it at 16, and then that can be reviewed within a period of time, for example, 3 years, and/or you can encourage post-legislative scrutiny of the legislation. Obviously, I understand the committee has a role in this as well, but certainly a strong steer from government that this will be reviewed in the future to see if the bill/law is fit for purpose is quite a helpful, I think, way forward. And I would welcome the Cabinet Secretary's view on this. It may be that she's not considered these points yet. I'm quite happy if she gets back to the committee on my suggestions.
Cabinet Secretary.
So I'm very grateful to Mr Stewart. I think those are both very positive suggestions that recognise that there is not necessarily a single right answer in this situation, and I'm very happy to consider that further and respond to the committee in due course.
Very much. David Stewart.
Convener. The Scottish Children's Reporters Administration note and evidence that the bill, and I'm quoting, does not offer therapeutic supports beyond the forensic medical examination. Do the witnesses agree?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the bill needs to be looked at alongside the work of the task force in terms of what it is we're trying to achieve. And the bill, if you like, is the legislative underpinning where that is necessary. The whole approach here is a trauma-informed approach, and that is by its very nature both multidisciplinary and therapeutic. So I think it is an unfair criticism of the bill, given that that is not the bill's purpose, but it sits alongside the overall work of the task force and the commitment to that trauma-informed, health-based service.
David Stewart.
If I can move on just to my final question. In the Cabinet Secretary's opening remarks, she said that the bill was consistent with the principles of the Barnahus model, which viewers may know is the original Icelandic scheme, which means children's house. And it's really about involving children in the justice system and is geared up to be more efficient and sensitive to children's trauma. Could the Cabinet Secretary just say a little bit more about this important principle, which has, as she will know, been picked up by many other European countries?
Cabinet Secretary.
It has indeed, and it is one that the Scottish Government, across government, is committed to pursuing. And so my comments in my opening remark, in effect, are to say that I believe that the approach in terms of the legislation set alongside the wider work of the task force and the overall approach I've just described about a therapeutic model that is interagency and multidisciplinary and is focused on both the physical and psychological needs of the individual, as well as the collection of appropriate and recognised forensic evidence, contributes to the overall Barnahus principle. And that's why I've said that I believe the bill is Barnahus ready. In and of itself, it does not deliver in total what we are seeking in pursuing a Barnahus model, but it contributes to that and most certainly does not contradict that overall ambition.
Thank you very much. I now call on Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the Cabinet Secretary and to your colleagues. Can I ask questions around whether or not children and young people alleged to have perpetrated sexual assault and abuse should be included within the bill? And I think it's fair to say there's quite a bit of conflicting opinion here. The NSPCC seem to be in favour, and Rape Crisis Scotland seem to be not in favour of this. So can I ask what consideration the Scottish Government have given to extending the provisions in the bill to cover alleged child perpetrators?
Cabinet Secretary.
So, Mr Whittle, thank you very much for the question, and you are, of course, absolutely right. There are conflicting and often strongly held views in this area. The task force has undertaken and is undertaking some work in this, and with your agreement, I'd ask our CMO to contribute and advise you on what the task force is doing with its subgroup looking at this.
Gregor Smith.
Thank you. I think it's really important that this area is addressed as well, and it's certainly been picked up as part of the task force work, where there's a specific subgroup of the task force which is examining the approach to children and young people who have been accused as perpetrators of sexual assault. It's really important that we understand that this is a very complex area, and already we're starting to see some movement in terms of the guidance around about how these people should be perhaps examined, and the type of interagency discussion that is necessary to be had, particularly in the older age groups between 13 and 16, before any decision to examine and the location of that examination takes place as well. So this is work that is underway. My own view is that it's right that this is picked up as part of a pathway approach in terms of how we approach this very complex clinical area. As well, often these people have experienced trauma themselves, and that needs to be very carefully and sensitively explored. And rather than using legislation and build it into legislation where it might potentially complicate and delay the greater intent of the focus of the bill, then I think that's right that we can pick up this appropriately by other means.
Thank you very much. Brian Whittle.
Thank you. Can I ask then whether the Scottish Government has considered allowing for the examination collection of forensic samples from alleged perpetrators in a healthcare setting rather than police custody?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I don't think there is a straightforward yes or no answer to this particular question. I think the starting point is probably one that says, as Dr. Smith has just said, that oftentimes alleged perpetrators are also themselves victims of abuse. And in that situation, you would be wanting to collect the evidence in a way that also is supportive and certainly not creating any more trauma or difficulty for the individual. However, I do think it has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis in consultation with Police Scotland to determine in each individual circumstance what may be the right way to approach this. And as I say, I don't think there is a straightforward right yes or no answer. Certainly we would not see those healthcare facilities as barring individuals who are alleged perpetrators, but equally I can understand there would be circumstances where that would not necessarily be appropriate either.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. If I may, can I move on to retention services and the time scales for retention period of evidence collected from forensic medical examination? I probably should declare an interest here in that I've been working with a constituent over the past couple of years of historical sexual abuse, and that trial goes to trial tomorrow, and that is a period of time of over 40 years ago. So you maybe understand my interest in this particular line of questioning. So can I, again, in oral evidence, I think there was a real lack of consensus between organisations around this, and I can understand that, but can I ask what progress has been made on seeking a consensus about the appropriate timescale for retention of that evidence?
Cabinet Secretary.
So quite a lot of work has been done on this, and my colleagues may want to add to what I'm going to say. There is a group which is part of the Task Force Self-Referral subgroup that is working to develop a national protocol that would implement the provisions of the bill. There is no consistency when we look elsewhere at self-referral services, for example, across the UK. Retention periods in England, Wales and Northern Ireland range between 1 and 7 years. In Scotland, the Archway Service in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde currently retain their evidence for 18 months. So far, the information that's been gathered and the members of that group, which include the Health Service, Police Scotland, the Scottish Police Authority, the Crown Office, have reached a consensus that a period of 2 years and 2 months feels about right. But there is further work that needs to be undertaken before we can be confident of settling on that period. And I am mindful, actually, Mr. Whittle, of what you have, if you like, self-declared in terms of your parallel interest in this area. And so that, again, this is not a straightforward question, but we still will work that through. But at this point, the consensus is around 2 years 2 months.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you. I think it's already been mentioned, we heard some incredibly compelling evidence from victims of sexual crimes. So I wondered whether you'd be concerned, you consider the views of victims in making a decision of this nature.
Cabinet Secretary.
So I think that's a very important point, and with your agreement, I'd perhaps ask Tansy Main, who I know has been involved in all of this, if she wants to say a little bit more about how we will now make progress on this.
Tansy Main.
Good morning, Convener. Thank you. So, as the Cabinet Secretary highlighted, we have a subgroup under the remit of the CMO Task Force that's looking at the implementation of the provisions of the bill. And there's a task and finish group that sits beneath that subgroup that's specifically looking at the protocol for health boards around the retention and storage of evidence, but also around the retention period, which will be set out in secondary legislation. And that work so far, so that, as the Cabinet Secretary said, it involves the Crown Office, Rape Crisis Scotland, police and health boards. And Sandy Brinley, who is the Chief Executive of Rape Crisis Scotland, plays a very important part on that group and helps to ensure that the voice of lived experience is fed into those considerations. And our proposal would be that when we do some further work and analysis on what the appropriate retention period might be, that we will take that to survivors through the survivor reference group that is linked to the task force and ask for their views on that. I know that when survivors gave evidence to the committee in early March, they had suggested that they would like a retention period for as long as possible. That has to be balanced with of course, the need to provide an element of closure for survivors and it not being something that carries on forever, and also a consideration is the storage requirements within health boards. And I think just to pick up on the previous point, it's also worth just noting that in terms of historical abuse, that often doesn't come to light until many months or years after that abuse has taken place, in which case the DNA evidence wouldn't be obtained. DNA evidence in acute child sexual abuse cases is normally obtained within 7 days. So for historic cases, that, as I say, the abuse often doesn't come to light within that time frame, and therefore the retention period for those cases will be less relevant.
Thank you very much. Brian Whittle.
Thank you. Finally, Convener, if I may, given that the sort of lack of consensus across all organisations, can I ask that will the timescales for retention be subject to regular review? Will that sit within the front of the bill, Cabinet Secretary?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I think this is a perfectly reasonable question, very sensible, and it goes back to really Mr. Stewart's part of his line of questioning about recognising that there will be, whilst we will have to settle on particular matters as we go through this bill's progress, there will nonetheless be, in some areas, no absolute right or wrong answer, and therefore we should be willing to review provisions in the bill in a particular period. And as I said to Mr. Stewart, I'm very happy to consider how we might do that and come back to committee in due course, and I will incorporate Mr. Whittle's point in that consideration too. Of course, if the committee has particular views itself, then I'd be very grateful to hear those.
Okay, thank you. And now call Sandra White.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. If I could follow on from Brian Whittle's questions in regards to the type of evidence that health boards are expected to retain. I understand Tansy Main had mentioned a protocol. Now, I wonder if you're able to clarify, Cabinet Secretary, what type of evidence health boards would be required to store. Have you made that decision yet? And would that be part of the protocol which Tansy Main had mentioned?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I think, Convener, for speed, it's probably best now just to go straight to Tansy and get her to clarify what the protocol covers and the procedure on retention.
Tansy Main.
Thank you, Convener. So at the moment, the work of the subgroup that are looking to develop the protocol are doing so on the basis that the evidence that will be retained will be, as it is now, in accordance with the guidance published by the Faculty of Forensic and Legal Medicine, who they set out guidance about what forensic samples should be obtained following a rape or sexual assault, and that applies in both police referral and self-referral cases. And so on that basis, what the group are considering at the moment is that the biological samples will be retained, and that may also include images from a colposcope and from an internal examination, and if relevant, also underwear, sanitary wear or condoms, if they are relevant to the case. And the clinician will be able to make a judgment about whether or not that is required based on the information that the complainant has provided to them. There may be rare circumstances in which there's been evidence of ejaculation onto clothing, in which case the clinician would make a decision about whether or not to retain that item. And if they were in any doubt, they can contact the lead scientist at the Scottish Police Authority, who's on call 24/7, to check whether or not they think retaining that item would provide an opportunity for DNA analysis and have some evidential value. The two health boards in Scotland at the moment that provide self-referral are of the view that going forward, when we have a national protocol, that all health boards should be taking the same approach, and that should be limited to the evidence I've just set out. So the biological samples, underwear, etc., if required, and in exceptional circumstances, if there's a requirement for an item of clothing, for example. But there's no proposal at the moment to retain large or bulky items or anything that might be within a scene of crime remit, which is very much in an investigative territory that would reside with Police Scotland.
Sandra Hart.
One of the comments that you made, Tansy, in regards to the clinician will decide whether that evidence, and obviously he would contact the police, as you said as well. What about the victim in this? If the victim was insistent on a certain piece of clothing, do they have a say on what evidence is being retained?
Tansy May.
Thank you, Convener. I think it's important to emphasise that in the process of an initial consultation, when someone attends for a self-referral, information is provided to the person to explain what self-referral is and what it isn't, and it's explained that it is not the same as a police investigation, and that by retaining biological samples and other relevant evidence that may have evidential value from DNA testing, it doesn't mean that all evidence relating to that suspected crime will be obtained. So the complainer needs to be able to make a decision about whether or not self-referral is right for them. If someone was insistent that something to be kept, I think that decision needs to be taken by the clinician on the basis of whether or not there's any evidence that there may be DNA that can be found on that item. And as I say, if they were in any doubt, then they would seek the expert advice of the forensic scientists at the Scottish Police Authority.
Sandra Hart.
To push this one as well. On the other side, basically what I was trying to get at, if it was self-referral and the incident wasn't reported to police, then basically medical examinations, the evidence could be lost. Is there could that happen in that respect?
Tansy May.
And no, the evidence would not be lost. It would be stored securely within the health board according to the national protocol that's being developed, which will be agreed with Police Scotland and the Crown Office and the Lord Advocate. So I'm not quite sure what you mean. If you mean loss of evidence in terms of things that the police might otherwise be
reported
looking for,
to the police, would it be lost? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the very nature of self-referral, is that the police are not involved. So if there is CCT evidence, if there or fingerprints on glasses in a nightclub, for example, these kind of things, that is explained to the person that those other kinds of evidence will be lost if they do not report at that point in time, and the person can then decide whether or not they wish to go ahead with examination and just have the forensic evidence from that retained, and then they can consider whether to report to the police at a later date.
Thank you very much. I remind members and witnesses it's important not to talk over each other because of the time quality. Sandra White.
Thank you, Convener. My fault in that particular aspect of it. I'm going to ask the Cabinet Secretary. I think anyway in this particular one, I've just came off of Tansy talking about the various evidence. Would there be advantages in allowing the analysis of samples by the Scottish Police Authority prior to a case being reported to police?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I think we need to hold really carefully in our heads here the distinction between a report to the police, which then triggers an investigation, and Tansy covered what a police investigation would look at, alongside a self-referral, which is largely a healthcare-led service, which is focused on the physical and psychological needs of the individual, but also has the capacity to retain forensic evidence that has an evidential value. And so there is a distinction there, and part of the way that the approach works is ensuring that the individual who is making the self-referral understands what the difference is and is therefore able to make a better informed choice about how they want to progress and what they then want to do. In terms of whether or not you would have SPA analyse samples in the way that Ms White asks, I cannot see the value of that. Remember that we have got sexual offence examiners properly trained, and part of what is included in their training is not only how to secure samples with evidential value, but how to know where those samples may be and how to go about that exercise. So I'm not entirely sure where the value might be in bringing SPA in, who would decide that, and what would that add to the process. I could be wrong, and there may be more the committee wants to say to us about that, but at this point I am not seeing where the value of that might be.
Sandra.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I must admit, I do agree with you. I think it goes against the grain of this actual bill itself. My last question, there's been talk about anonymous databases. Have yourself or the government given any consideration of establishing anonymous DNA databases?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the most recent written evidence from Police Scotland and the UK Information Commissioner's Office cautions against any anonymous DNA databases, and the Crown Office has been clear that a proposal to do that would need to be fully defined about what we meant and how that would operate before they would comment on it. It's not a matter that has been consulted on. I know it arose in the course of stage 1 evidence. The existing national UK and Scottish DNA databases, which contain DNA profiles of people suspected or convicted of committing a crime, are subject to pretty rigorous legal and governance controls. So at this point, it is not a matter that we have given consideration to, although, of course, if the committee wants to make any points to us in its stage 1 report, then I will, of course, consider that along with any other points the committee is making to us at that time.
Thank you very much. I now call Emma Harper.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and witnesses. I just want to thank you for the work that you've done so far. I'm interested in the process for raising public awareness of self-referral and signposting. Cabinet Secretary, how do you envisage that people will be made aware of the self-referral service?
Cabinet Secretary.
So there is a work stream, excuse me, that's chaired by Rape Crisis Scotland, which is undertaking a feasibility study and an options appraisal to consider how individuals will access self-referral, in other words, how they will be made aware of its existence, looking across to see what other partners may help in the delivery of that. There's some consideration of a national awareness raising campaign being looked at, and the group is also consulting with other stakeholders as it excuse me, progresses that work, including Deaf Scotland, RNIB, People First, Young Scot, and so on, to try and ensure that it captures as many contributions as possible before determining how we will raise public awareness, but also perhaps target specific groups of people to make sure that they know that the service exists.
Thank you, Convener. And so in a national public awareness campaign, I'm sure there's been some consideration for Black, Asian, ethnic minority community as well. Can you touch on that a wee bit as well?
Cabinet Secretary.
Of course, be part of the range of stakeholders. I didn't name them, but in that group of consultees, if you like, that the Rape Crisis Scotland's led workstream work will undertake. There are a range of different groups, young people, BAME, of course, the travelling community and others that you want to be able to reach. And that does mean at times that not only, whilst the messages that you are conveying are consistent, the means by which you channel those messages will differ. Depending on the group that you're looking at. So the task force, or that subgroup of the task force, will come back, I'm sure, with some key pieces of information that it wants to ensure that people receive, and I suspect a range of methods by which that should be promulgated and then consistently followed up, because there's no point in just doing a big ta-da moment at the point when a service becomes available. You want people to be consistently aware of it. And of course, making sure that other important partners like Police Scotland and others also have information that they can pass on to individuals who may benefit from the service.
Emma Harper.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I should have mentioned also persons with additional support needs as well to be considered. You mentioned earlier that 8.5 million of Scottish Government money has been utilised for this whole process. I'm interested in who would be responsible for funding the public information or education campaign. Would that be additional resource funding for that?
Cabinet Secretary.
We'd simply need to make sure, excuse me, in terms of the initial funding, whether there was more needed for that. This would be an NHS-led, NHS Scotland-led campaign, because it is a health service. And of course, the NHS brand is well recognised and trusted. So we would want to ensure that that was at the forefront here, and also, but we would make sure that the resourcing was there to support that consistent information campaign.
Thank you, Convener. So my final question is just in order to for people to be informed or make an informed decision about whether to report an incident to the police, will the Police Scotland have a role to play in informing people about the self-referral services also?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, they will, and they are a very active and enthusiastic partner to all of this work, and we've benefited a great deal from their input.
Thank you very much. I now call Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and to the other witnesses. I wanted to ask questions following Emma Harper with regards to advocacy services. So I wondered, how will the Scottish Government ensure that people who have self-referred for forensic medical examination will have early access to advocacy?
Cabinet Secretary.
The word, and I think if the CMO would want to add any additional points. Advocacy is an important element of this. Remember, we are talking about a trauma-informed service, and so that in and of itself recognises the importance of the individual's psychological and mental health and their needs in that regard, and that includes having support in order to express what it is that they want in a situation where they may find that difficult to do for understandable reasons. So there is a role, of course, and a lot of advice coming to us from Rape Crisis Scotland in that regard, but perhaps the CMO might want to say a bit more about how the task force is looking at this.
Gregor Smith.
Thank you, Convener. So this is a really important area. Advocacy is something which is becoming increasingly important in all aspects of healthcare, so it should be no different in relation to this. And the Rape Crisis Scotland Advocacy Project has been very helpful in helping to inform, through the work of the task force, the approach that we should be adopting with this. I think it's, again, important to make the distinction between the underpinning elements of the legislation here and the work of the task force, and making sure that we've got optimal pathways of care that we can monitor and make sure that the quality standards around about those are as good as we can possibly make them. And I see advocacy very much as fitting into this latter part, and very much as to how the NHS in Scotland responds to the need for advocacy for this group of people, and works particularly with our third sector partners in making sure that that is accessible and available to them when that is required. As I say, this is not unique in particular to this sphere of clinical practice, but is something which is much broader.
Miles Briggs.
For that, I wanted to ask what research the Scottish Government had also undertaken into same-sex cases, and any bespoke support which the Government might look to put in place for these individuals.
Cabinet Secretary.
So perhaps if Mr Briggs wouldn't mind just explaining a little more what it is he's asking here.
Miles Briggs.
Individuals where it's been same-sex cases. Cabinet
Secretary.
So regardless of who has perpetrated sexual abuse on the individual's health and mental well-being and psychological needs will by and large be comparable, regardless of whether or not the abuse was perpetrated by someone of the same sex as them or of the opposite sex. So part of the discussions, and it may be that Tansy will want to add here, or Greg rather, but part of the discussions is to look and make sure that what we are proposing and how this service is established is equitable and accessible to all individuals, regardless of their sex or sexual orientation. But I'm not quite seeing why there would be any particular difference in the approach, the trauma-informed approach, and the service that is offered that would follow from the sex of the individual who perpetrated the abuse. And my apologies if I'm missing something, and it may be the committee will want to say something to us in their report on that. But if either Tansy or Greg want to add to that, then I'm happy for them to do so.
Greg Walker.
Good morning, Convener. Thank you very much. I think the first point to make in response to the question is the bill has been deliberately drafted in gender-neutral language. So it talks about people, it doesn't talk about female victims. And so that approach is quite deliberate, following the development of the Equality Impact Assessment, which I think is in the members' papers this week. And it's so that all victims have the same legal entitlements under the bill, irrespective of sex, age, race, or other distinguishing characteristics. I think there were some interesting stats that were provided by Phil Capaldi following on from his oral evidence, and they show that the predominant dynamic in sexual offending is male perpetrator, female victim. And so that phrase I gave you, drafted in gender neutral language, is quite carefully crafted because we don't see this as a gender neutral bill. It is informed by the gender dynamics which are in play in the Equally Safe portfolio.
Thank you very much. Miles Briggs.
And my final question was with regards to mental health assessment and support. I wanted to ask what the Cabinet Secretary felt should be available for people accessing services. How will this be provided, and also how will ministers ensure that the same level of support is put in place across Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
So, as I said more than once, this is a trauma-informed service, very deliberately so, and it's also intended as a national service, hence the national standards and the overall national protocol and approach. So our intention, therefore, is that regardless of where you are in Scotland, notwithstanding the particular challenges we talked about at the very outset, in delivery terms, around, for example, the remote and rural community, our overall intention as a government is that wherever you are in Scotland, you will receive the same standard and quality of service and access to the services around that service, if you like. And that does include psychological support, which may then be continuing psychological support, depending on what the individual needs. And because this is a health service, then that psychological support would come through the health service.
Thank you very much. I now call David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and to your colleagues. Cabinet Secretary, how will health boards be encouraged to cooperate with each other and share best practice, and how will this be overseen and monitored?
Cabinet Secretary.
Very much. I think the CMO may want to add a few words to what I've said around the idea of the national clinical pathway, but I think as has been clear, our health boards are heavily involved in this work in terms of the work of the task force, which sits alongside or which this bill underpins. And so the prospect and the proposition of a national service, a national protocol, national standards, all of that are designed to have involved our health boards, but are designed to ensure that this isn't open to local interpretation. This is a national service that boards are then required to deliver against and are report against in terms of the various quality standards and so on. But underpinning that, of course, is the clinical approach. And on that, the CMO may want to add a few words.
Gregor Smith.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, there's a whole variety of ways that we can start to achieve that consistency of approach across the country. And one of the things I want to emphasise to the committee this morning is the degree of cooperation that has taken place, certainly across the clinical community, but also between the clinical community and the wider group of stakeholders in relation to the aims of the task force and what we're trying to achieve with the legislation that we would want to introduce as well. As I say, there's a variety of ways that we can do that. First of all, through the specialty organisations that are associated with this area of work, organisations such as the Faculty of Medicine and Legal Medicine, Forensic and Legal Medicine, through the clinical networks that have formed between forensic medical examiners across the country, but how they've broadened over time to include other disciplines and professions within that grouping of people as well. I could also point towards the cooperation that has occurred between different boards in terms of developing regional approaches to care, all with the aim of achieving much greater access, quality of service and consistency of service in mind. And then, of course, there's the underpinning all this, both the national clinical pathways that have been developed, but also the national quality standards as well, which have been developed, first of all, on an interim basis, but now launched more fully in March 2020 by Health Improvement Scotland. All of this points towards different vehicles that we can use to maximise certainly that enthusiasm and eagerness to make sure that we continue to improve care. But what it does is it harnesses those broader clinical communities in a way that gives them something to kind of wrap their approach around. We continue to explore different ways in the future that we might continue to enhance this, for instance, through perhaps through the emergence of a managed clinical network or national clinical network in relation to this. But as I say, a variety of approaches just to make sure that that consistency of quality service is approached right across the country.
David Torrance.
What plans does the Scottish Government have for monitoring and reporting of quality indicators, and will this information be made publicly available?
Cabinet Secretary.
So, as we've already said, there are his quality indicators, and the service will be monitored against those, and that monitoring, or the results of that monitoring, will of course be made public. I think we would anticipate an annual report of performance against those quality indicators.
David Torrance.
And my final question, Convener, will additional support be needed for smaller health boards to implement the legislation, and will the implementation of the legislation be evaluated in relation to the impact of people by protected characteristics and socio-economic disadvantage?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I think the latter point from Mr. Torrance is very important, and I'm grateful to him for raising it. I do think that the impact of the legislation, in however we collectively agree it should be evaluated and considered, should take account of its impact on protected characteristics and on areas of social economic disadvantage. I think that is important to see how this makes progress. There will be other evaluative areas as well, of course, I'm sure. In terms of support for smaller health boards, of course, there is in our NHS a long-standing tradition of cross-board support for each other on a range of different services. And as we look to deliver this national service, part of what we would instinctively begin is to see where smaller boards can be assisted in what they're doing by larger boards. And then if in addition there is further support that is needed, then we would of course look at that, because we are determined to ensure that what is delivered here is a national service.
Thank you very much. And I now call George Adam.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I would just like to ask a question that's regarding financial implications on resource with the bill in particular. You know, obviously it's important that this bill delivers what it sets out to do, but there has been a number of claims made by Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board where they said the estimated costs do not take into account any changes of existing services or the potential for increased provision leading to increased demand on existing services resulting from increased public confidence in the service. Now, when you take, obviously I serve an area that is part of Greater Glasgow and Clyde's Health Board area, and I know a lot of the things that they say aren't necessarily what they actually do in reality. But if you're taking that into consideration, Cabinet Secretary, what would be your response to these claims by Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks very much. So my starting point would be to remind all of us that health boards are already delivering police referral service under the existing Memorandum of Understanding, and that there was a baseline transfer of 7.6 million for forensic medical services from the police to health in 2014, when health boards took over responsibility for the delivery of these services. The modelling assumptions that we have made in the financial memorandum predicts an incremental 10% increase in demand for self-referral, and obviously each health board would incur a proportionate share of that cost. All of that notwithstanding, we do accept that there could be a revenue tail, as we would describe it, from the initial pump prime funding that I mentioned, the 8.5 million. And so government finance officials and boards continue to work through what is any additional expected financial pressure. But I am comfortable at this point that, notwithstanding that a degree of these services are already delivered by health boards and therefore accommodated in their financial envelope, and there was that baseline transfer, I think the planning assumption in the financial memorandum is a sensible one, and I've not seen any evidence yet from a health board or anywhere else that 10% increase in demand as a planning assumption for the financial memorandum is in any way off kilter.
Georgia.
Thank you, Convener. As always, the Cabinet Secretary has been impeccable with answering. She's already answered the supplementary question, so I have no further questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. In that case, we have time for a brief supplementary from Brian Whittle. Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener, and Cabinet Secretary. Apologies, I really should have asked this question. My initial questions. You will know my interest around the technology and having the correct technology to deliver on government policy. So I just wondered, when we go back to retention, do we have a digital platform that will allow for that digital retention of evidence that will allow it to be kept over an extended period of time?
Cabinet Secretary.
And I did wonder, Mr. Whittle, that you hadn't asked me anything about technology. I thought it might have been a first, but there we go. If you don't mind, I'll ask Tansy to respond in detail to that.
Tansy, maybe.
Thank you, Convener. So part of the package of resources that the task force will be introducing before the end of this calendar year includes new national forms to ensure that information and data from a forensic medical examination is collated consistently across Scotland. And those forms will be paper-based initially, but we are already working on a national clinical IT system for the whole of Scotland, which will mean that those forms will be online and that information can be transferred to the analysts in Public Health Scotland to analyse that data, and they will then use that to be able to assess Health Board performance against his quality indicators. And part of that clinical IT system will provide the functionality for things like colposcope images to be retained securely on the file. So I'm not sure what you mean in terms of how long information will be kept, but the clinical IT system will have a mechanism to ensure that if it gets to the end of the retention period, if that's determined to be, for example, 2 years, 2 months, that the forensic information will be deleted from that record and only healthcare information will be retained.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Cabinet Secretary and to all her officials for taking part in this meeting. That concludes our question session and our formal evidence session. So thank you very much for your participation. We will move into private session shortly, and I therefore suspend this meeting, and we will resume on a different platform at 10:50. Thank you very much.